Welcome to the Defining the Threat, Iranian Strategy in Syria Defense Education Forum. If your boarding pass shows a different destination, you can stay. And we also, as Bob said, welcome our internet audience as well. We actually had an earlier program on Iran's influence in South America, which sounds like a fairly narrow topic, but we filled this room with a couple hundred people and had 4,500 people logged on to the webcast from 13 countries. So these are popular events with an audience far beyond what is seated here. So it's a privilege again to welcome all of you to the Minuteman Memorial Building of the Reserve Officers Association. This is an organization that's 90 years old. It was founded in 1922 by General Blackjack Pershing, and then chartered by Harry Truman, whose picture is on the wall. He was one of the plank holders in 22. Chartered as a congressionally chartered organization with the mission of advocating for a strong national defense and, by extension, a strong reserve force as part of that defense. I see a couple people with gray hair. And you get a free lunch. Oh, you already have that. If you can identify the portrait on the wall in the middle, the officer in boots and saddles, Army uniform. That was the most feared man in America in the mid-1960s. General Lewis Hershey, who was the head of the draft during Vietnam. And many of us went into uniform compliments of General Hershey. Today's program is going to be our third in Defining the Threat series with our partners at the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute for the Study of War. Under the guidance of Fred Kagan and Kim Kagan, they have assembled a truly outstanding group of young scholars that I just had the opportunity to meet, who will be briefing us today on the Iranian strategy in Syria and its implications. I have heard terrific things about this series, which brings cutting-edge thinking and ideas on major threats facing the world and the United States today. We're also pleased to announce that we are going to be doing the fourth in the series on this subject in about a month, where we're going to bring in about 200 senior officers in the reserve component from all the services who will be studying at the Reserve Officers National Security course at National Defense University. So we look forward to this audience and our internet audience joining us for further ROA defense education forums on this topic and others. We also will be holding our National Security Symposium here in DC, August 7th to 10th at the Wardman Park Marriott, with again, particularly on August 8 and 9 in the morning, go on our website, you can see the programs, a blue chip lineup of top-level speakers on the subject of national security. Last commercial before we get on with the program. ROA has a very good daily email news service that's free. And open to anybody. You don't have to have been a reserve officer or wear a uniform. Often, many of us who are out of uniform find it difficult to get access to the early bird, Pentagon's early bird. And if we have access to it, the 200 stories can take up the better part of a morning. Well, we have a program that's called ROA Smart Brief, and our algorithms does a scrape through all of the news stories on defense of the day, and then two human editors cull that down to the 10 most important stories, write a précis, and then a link to the full story. And it appears on your smartphone, your PC, however you want it, via email at about 2 o'clock every afternoon. In order to sign up for it, all you do is go to www.smartbrief.com/ROA. And we'll ask for your email, and that's all you need to give, and you're signed up. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, expert. You think of all the academic and intellectual superlatives you can to describe somebody who really has done it all in the field of analysis of national security, and that's Kimberly Kagan, who is president of the Institute and founder of the Institute for the Study of War. Notably, in recent years, she has been an advisor to Generals Petraeus and Allen in Afghanistan on their conduct of that war. And I think it's also important to note that her superlative credentials overcame a second-class education at the City College of New Haven. It's also known as Yale University. There's a couple of us at the table. One of the presenters, Joe, and I are Princeton grads, so we can get away with that. So without further ado, Kim, it's yours.
So much. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here today and out in our internet audience. Welcome as well. I know what you want to hear about is Iranian strategy in Syria, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief. The Institute for the Study of War and the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute are two nonprofit institutes that seek to provide the very best possible open source analysis of strategic issues that pertain to the security of the United States of America, and in particular, look at the threats to U.S. national security in areas where there is already violent conflict or the potential for violent conflict, with a zoomed down focus on the Middle East, really running from Africa all the way to Afghanistan. It is actually a great pleasure and great opportunity for us to help inform strategic decision makers, commanders, our policymakers, and really educated members of the American public about what is actually happening in the world as a precursor to having a discussion about what should be done to address the national security threats and problems that are out there. So the Institute for the Study of War is online at understandingwar.org. Critical Threats is at criticalthreats.org. And I hope that you'll check out the websites there and also make sure that you find some of the wonderful research that these presenters and others have done. Today, we are going to be talking about Iranian strategy in Syria. I think it is a topic that is really timely right now as we have watched a change in momentum toward the regime and away from the opposition inside of Syria since the fall of Qusayr earlier this month. And since, in fact, understanding what U.S. national interests are in Syria and understanding how the Syrian regime is behaving and being supported really relies first and foremost on an understanding of Iranian strategy in Syria, since Iran has been the chief backer of the Assad regime in its fight to control its country. The Critical Threats Project and the Institute for the Study of War did a joint paper published in May called Iranian Strategy in Syria. The two of the authors will present today. Joe Holliday, who is a fellow at the Institute for the Study of War and who has studied Syria during his time as an analyst with us. Will Fulton, who is the Palantir Fellow at the Critical Threats Project and who began at Critical Threats as an analyst on the Iran portfolio, and Marisa Sullivan, who is also a fellow at the Institute for the Study of War, who has been with the Institute for the Study of War since its founding, has served as my deputy, and serves now as a fellow as she is pursuing a more academic than administrative role. These three scholars are absolutely some of the most impressive young folks you will find here in town. And they bring together a fused understanding of what is going on in Syria, what is going on inside the Iranian regime and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and what is going on in and among Shia militant groups such as Hezbollah and Iraqi Shia militants fighting inside of Syria. And so without further ado, let me please ask you to join me in welcoming them, and first and foremost, Joe Holliday.
Well, thanks, Kim, and thanks to the Reserve Officers Association for hosting us today. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to run through sort of the context and try to provide a little bit of the framework for understanding what Iran is trying to achieve in its investment that it's been going on in Syria. After I go through that, then just to give you everyone a sense of sort of framework of the discussion here, Will is going to come up and talk about some of the specific Iranian actors that we've seen involved in the Syrian conflict and how they sort of interlock and work together. And then Marisa Lass is going to come up and talk about some of the proxies and partners of the Iranian regime and how they have figured into the course of this conflict. So if we get to the next slide. Or is there, oh, the clip is right here. Okay, bingo. Okay, so forgive some beginning framing pieces of information here, but I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page because I think this is important. Just off the bat to put both Iran and Syria on the same map briefly. So Syria and Iran have been, or rather Syria has been Iran's only state ally since its inception in the 1979 revolution. And it's important to recognize the depth and the importance of that relationship to the Iranian regime. It's also important to recognize that this relationship has changed over time. When the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, it found itself almost immediately in a war with Iraq. And at that point in time, Hafez al-Assad of Syria found that it would be to his advantage as well to partner with the Iranians in opposing the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And at that point in time, because the Iranian, the Islamic Republic of Iran was so young, the Assad regime was the dominant power, the dominant state in that relationship. That changed over time. And really the inflection point that we see happened in the 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War, 1970s, 80s Lebanese Civil War, when you saw sort of Syria and Iran's interests diverge over their Lebanese proxies, with Syria supporting Amal and Iran supporting Hezbollah. And really, you see Iran become more dominant with the overall ascendance of Hezbollah over time. And Marisa will discuss some of that. So first of all, it's important to recognize that Syria has not always been a pliant ally of Iran. In fact, they've been the dominant ally. And even when they haven't been dominant, they've been prickly. They've been looking out for their own interests as best as possible. So in order to understand why Iran is interested in projecting its influence and its power into the Levant, Will found a really interesting recent quote from the senior military advisor to the Ayatollah, in which he said that heretofore Iran has pursued power and influence in the Mediterranean, or out to the Mediterranean, 3 times. The first time during the era of Cyrus, along with the liberation of Jerusalem. And the second time was during the era of Xerxes and the crossing of the Bosporus Strait and the Greek campaign. The third time is the present period, during which the power of Lebanese Hezbollah, the long arm of Iranian defensive power, has been formed as the strategic defensive power of Iran. Now, hyperbole aside, it's important to recognize the extent of the Iranian project to try to reconnect the Shia crescent, as it's called. So what this map shows you is majority ethnicities in different parts of the region, where the dark green here are Shia, which again you can see dark green in pockets in here, and the light green are Sunni populations. And so the so-called Shia crescent stretches from Bahrain and the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, through Iran and southern Iraq primarily, and then over to the coastal areas of the Levant. And this is what really what Iran is looking to do is be able to project its power and really increase its defense in depth by being able to project influence all the way out to the Mediterranean. Understanding the importance of this campaign, this strategy, really gives us clues to why Iran has invested as much as they have in supporting the Assad regime, and that's something that we will be discussing through the rest of this. So, and a key piece of that is the importance of Hezbollah, which we hit on, and I'll leave the rest of that to Marisa. So, what I'm going to talk about the rest of the time here is what is Iran's minimum required end state for maintaining influence in the Levant and in Syria, and how are they going to go about achieving this objective. And so I think the best thing to do is to go through quickly and talk about the course of the conflict, just so everyone can get on the same page. This will just take a few minutes. So in 2011, during that whole year, basically, the peaceful protest movement that began transformed into an insurgency through the Assad regime's attempts to apply a military solution to what was fundamentally a political problem. The regime went from city to city and tried to quash the protests sequentially, systematically, using military force. This only exacerbated the uprising and militarized it. So in the beginning of 2012, the regime undertook a large-scale campaign to try to reestablish control over the country with its army. And that began in Damascus, where they tried to take back the town of Zabadani, which is a critically important location, precisely because it has historically been one of the key supply routes between Damascus and the airports around Damascus, where the Iranian regime can fly military equipment into, and the Bekaa Valley, where Hezbollah's stronghold is. That is the route by which, over the past 2 decades or more, the Iranian regime has flown military equipment into Syria and via the Assad regime supplied Hezbollah with military equipment. So right off the offset of the regime's offensive, we can see that they're taking this relationship into consideration very early on. After that, the regime moves north from Damascus to Homs and takes back Homs city. I think we all remember in February of 2012, the siege of Homs that really sort of upped the ante for the conflict overall. And then proceeded north to take back Idlib and garrison a large force in Aleppo. And that took them through about April of 2012. And they sort of had extended their force as far as they could at that point in time. However, they did not have enough forces to continue to pursue the opposition into the countryside. And what you saw emerge very quickly during the summer of 2012 was pockets of rebel-held control throughout the Syrian countryside. The northern Aleppo countryside, most of Idlib province and northern Hama province, and then also areas just north of Homs, Rastan, and then this Al-Qusayr, which is the one that the regime and Hezbollah recently took back, was originally liberated during that point in time in the conflict in the summer of 2012. So after these areas of rebel control are able to sort of gain some strength, the Turkish border opens up for some weapons to come across the border, and by the beginning of June, the rebels start going on the offensive and going after regime positions. And it's sort of the rebel offensive reaches its high water by the end of the year, and so that ran from about June of 2012 through December of 2012, in which they managed to overrun a number of air bases, Abu Duhur, Taftannaz, put a number of air bases under pressure, under siege, like Manakh up here, and maintain their control over these liberated areas. Namely, in the north, they expanded their control over eastern Syria. And then in Damascus, you really saw the rebels' advances hit a high water mark in a lot of respects when they managed to get close enough into the downtown Damascus area. And you saw the regime start to bring in assets from the Golan Heights, from Homs, from all these different parts of the country in order to reinforce its efforts in Damascus and stop that. Really, it was in January, February timeframe of this year that you saw sort of this all-out knockdown, drag-out fight for a town called Daraya right there in southern Damascus. which was sort of at the gates of downtown Damascus area that, that the regime controlled. So at the beginning of this year, once the regime stops that in the January-February timeframe, they're able to sort of start going on the offensive. The number one thing they do to go on the offensive is they break the siege of Aleppo, which is pretty critical. Up until that point, you can see this area in orange here. The rebels basically controlled the highway between Sarakib and Marat al-Numan, which made it impossible for the regime to resupply Aleppo by ground unless they were going up through Homs and then along the coast in this rather treacherous route up to Aleppo that way. This was a huge draw on their resources, and by, I think it was April timeframe, the regime managed to break the siege of Wadi Daif and begin to resupply the north, which allowed them to really start being more offensive and use their assets with more flexibility. And that turned next to taking back Al-Qusayr. And we'll talk more about Al-Qusayr later on with Maurice's presentation. But one thing that people don't quite note is that while Al-Qusayr was taken back, so was Jobar, which is this neighborhood here. So the regime's really been sort of on the offensive in a number of different areas. And to the sort of highest extent, we've even seen a number of consistent reports of Hezbollah operating as far north as the towns on the northern rim of Aleppo, Anadan and Hedatan. So what's the minimum required end state here? This is obviously in flux as the regime and Iran revise their assessments of what they can hope to achieve in this conflict. At the end of last year, there was sort of very consistent estimates of, well, the regime's going to go down within the next 2 months. Defeat is nonlinear. The army's falling apart. At that time was when we sort of finally published my report on the Assad regime, and what we saw looking at the Assad regime carefully is that they had a lot of staying power. They have the core of the military still intact, and critically, they have unquestioning support from a key ally, from Iran. They know they're going to continue to get resupply from them, and in order to, given that, so the worst case scenario for the Assad regime going forward, we assessed was really to make sure that they could control the most strategic areas of the country along the main north-south highway. Now, right now, it looks like the regime's upward revising their assessments of what they can hope to achieve here with their impending campaign in Aleppo that's been building in the news a lot recently, although we haven't quite seen them make that move yet. But the point is that the regime is at this point okay letting the opposition control the countryside to the north and to the east, and to make sure that they can control the key highway that connects Aleppo to Damascus, and critically control the areas of the country that are primarily, or the majority of the population in those areas is Alawite, essentially. So what's Iran's bottom line here is they need to be able to make sure that they have a base by which to project power in the Levant. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Assad regime has to control all of Syria. It doesn't actually even mean that the Assad regime has to remain in power. What it means as a minimum requirement is that the conflict persists in a low-intensity conflict scenario, but that Iran has more allies and more people that it can rely on to exert its influence than others in the region. And the fact is that even if Assad were to fall tomorrow, which we can see right now he's not, the biggest militia in Syria would be the remnants of the Assad regime. And they are closely related to, in relationship to the Iranians. And there's one, closing thought here before I turn over to just quickly frame what Will and Maurice are about to show you, is that the extent to which Assad has become beholden to or has become forced to respond to Iranian inputs has increased dramatically during the course of this conflict. And I think something that really crystallizes it was an incident in which rebels seized a number of Iranian IRGC ground force personnel in Damascus and eventually negotiated a prisoner swap that Will's going to go into in much greater detail. And when that happened, they swapped a bunch of rebel prisoners for these IRGC prisoners. no Assad regime individuals were part of this prisoner swap deal. And this resulted in a huge backlash among the regime's supporters. There was a lot of anger about why are we willing to conduct prisoner swaps for these these outsiders when we're not willing to conduct prisoner swaps for our own people here. And so I think being able to apply that type of leverage is important to consider. So what we're going to talk about here is the dual track strategy that that Iran is using to ensure that they can keep the Assad regime around for as long as possible, and failing that, ensure that after Assad there are plenty of options and avenues available to pursue its security interests in the Levant. And so the primary way of going about the first one is basically a MIT team that they've built, an advise and assist capacity that they've sent into Syria to support the Assad regime's military apparatus. This is actually new for Iran in the sense that they have not done state-to-state assistance for a foreign military in the past, and Will's going to go out this in much greater detail. The next thing, and this will be Maurice's brief here, is the proxies and the partners that Iran has used to support the regime and prolong its survival, but also to be able to ensure that they have options if Assad were to fall. And this is more classic. This is something that Iran has lots of practice with and has been doing with great success for a long period of time. And the last one, which is related to the proxies and partners conversation, is paramilitaries. And Iran has invested, from what we can tell, has invested a lot of its energies in supporting the paramilitary organizations that are around the Assad regime, the militias. They're typically known as the Shabiha, it's a specifically Syrian slang. But really, there's a whole range of these different paramilitary forces. The Shabiha are some of the more ruthless, ultra-nationalist, Alawites very close to the Assad regime. But you also have the so-called popular committees, which are basically local neighborhood watches of concerned, usually minority populations who have armed themselves to protect themselves from the opposition, from the rebels. And Iran's done a lot of work in trying to advise, assist, and resource this in the form primarily of something called the National Defense Force, which has become the overarching umbrella and organizing principle for the different militias inside Syria. There's a lot of tendency to compare this to the Basij, and that's valid in a lot of ways, but it's important to also recognize that the militias in Syria are a distinctly Syrian phenomena with very distinctly Syrian roots that go back to the beginning of the Ba'ath Party's reliance on militias. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will and let him talk about some of the specific Iranian actors we've seen pursue this dual track strategy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Joe. Great presentation, and thank you to ROA for having us. Very excited to be presenting here today. So as Joe said, I'm going to transition from a discussion of the broad strategy and try to zoom in to look at how Iran's security organizations are actually implementing that strategy on the ground, so sort of get into the weeds a little bit more. So as in the Iraq War, Iran has done an exceptional job, really, of obfuscating its role of what its security organizations are doing. This has been the case in Syria. But it's clear that elements are involved, but the nature and scope of what they've been doing has not always been entirely clear. We have, however, been able to make some assessments based on the available evidence, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here today. So the first of those is that Iran has deployed personnel from its most important security organizations to support Assad. The second is that Iran's efforts, as Joe described, have evolved into an expeditionary training and advisory mission. And a key component of that has been the forward deployment of Revolutionary Guards, quote-unquote conventional or ground forces commanders into this conflict. Again, as Joe said, this is something new and notable. And what they've been doing, it really is a notable expansion of their willingness and their ability to project military power beyond their borders. The recent deaths of several IRGC ground force commanders in Syria is actually fairly notable and suggests that Iran is perhaps expanding this element of their strategy. And finally, there have been, I'm sure many of you have seen, conflicting reports about whether the IRGC has deployed in an organized way large numbers of combat troops to fight in Syria, and there really is no evidence of that, but there is evidence of some smaller scale informal mobilizations, which I'll touch on. So here is a quick look at the Iranian security organizations that we know have been in country to provide the Assad regime support. And it's really no exaggeration to say that each of Iran's most important security organizations have had a hand in supporting Assad. So I think that's worth noting. The Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, which I'm sure many of you know well, was the first Iranian security organization to be designated by our Treasury Department for their support of the Assad regime, and that came very early on in the conflict in May 2011. It's very likely, it's most likely, we believe that the Quds Force is actually leading this effort, and there's a few reasons for that. So the Quds Force is the RGC's extraterritorial foreign military arm. It's their job to get involved in these types of conflicts. The Quds Force has long-standing ties to the Assad regime, and the commander of the IRGC, Major General Jafari, said as much in a press conference in September 2012 when he said that, of course the Quds Force has a presence in Syria and is supporting Assad. Essentially, that's their job. They've been there for many years. And finally, the commander of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, as he has self-described, really plays a leading role in Iran's regional policy, especially in conflict zones. Afghanistan, Iraq, we know he had a very important role, and in Lebanon and their partnership with Lebanese Hezbollah, and now again in Syria. We don't know really a great deal about Quds Force TTPs. We don't know exactly what they're doing on the ground, but we do know something about its personnel who have been providing support to the Assad regime. So first, as I mentioned, Qasem Soleimani during the Iraq War had a huge role his organization did, and he personally, in Iran's role and in developing Iran's proxies in that conflict, as well, of course, as their relationship with Lebanese Hezbollah. Mohsen Chazari, who is the third in command of the IRGC Quds Force and is the deputy for operations and training, had been in Iraq, was arrested in 2006, and was subsequently released after the Maliki government pressured coalition forces to release Chazari based on diplomatic grounds. And a unique case, IRGC Quds Force Brigadier General Hassan Shaturi, who was killed in Syria in February 2013 while traveling from Damascus to Beirut. Shaturi is an interesting case, mainly because he's so senior and because of his connections. So he had been in Afghanistan up until 2001, working with the Northern Alliance and Ahmed Shah Massoud before he was assassinated in 2001, then went on to Iraq, and since 2006 had been in Lebanon, working with Lebanese Hezbollah under a different alias, basically. Now, while Quds Force is leading this effort, or we believe is leading this overall effort, they have been drawing on other Iranian security organizations for their expertise, and this is really mapped with the evolution of the conflict, as Joe described, from really a political problem, an unarmed uprising, into a civil war and insurgency. So the players that have been involved in this have included the law enforcement forces, who were designated very early on for providing support to the Syrian General Intelligence Directorate. The deputy commander of that force, a brigadier general, met with Assad in April 2011. Iran's Ministry of Intelligence has also provided support early on in the conflict, and the IRGC intelligence organization, which is notable as at least in the open source, we haven't seen examples of IRGC intelligence working in other theaters, maybe with the exception of Afghanistan. Now, it makes sense that the Quds Force would draw on these organizations. If you look at who's up on the screen here, all three of these organizations played a major role in suppressing the 2009 post-election protests in Iran. So both with their technical capabilities, their experience in violently suppressing an uprising, and their lessons learned, really looking at what they'd done in 2009, the mistakes that they made, and then entering into new conflict with that experience. It makes good sense from the Iranian perspective that the Quds Force would draw on that. The Quds Force, of course, is a paramilitary arm whose work in the past had been playing the role of an insurgent, whereas now they're initially in a new role of suppressing an internal uprising, and now in the role of managing a conflict that's an insurgency and a civil war. So this perhaps is the most notable element of Iran's security strategy, and that is the forward deployment of conventional IRGC ground forces commanders into Syria. This is not something that we had seen before, as Joe said, and is notable. So first in September 2012, we saw a report that Hossein Hamadani, a brigadier general in the ground forces and a very senior Revolutionary Guards commander, was leading the effort essentially to train the Syrian Shabiha, which Joe talked about. Again, drawing on experience. So Hamadani in the 1990s played a major role in the IRGC's suppression of a Kurdish rebellion in Iran's northwest, a very violent and bloody consequence of that uprising. In 2007, when the IRGC restructured, formally incorporated the besieged military force into its ranks, Hamadani was the besieged deputy commander and played a major role in integrating that paramilitary besieged force into the Revolutionary Guard's conventional forces. And then finally in 2009, he was the IRGC's Greater Tehran unit commander and again played a significant role in suppressing that protest. Oops. So the next major development, which Joe spoke about, came in January 2013 after the prisoner swap that saw 48 Iranians who had been kidnapped in August 2012 released and returned to Iran. Now, ostensibly, of course, they were there on pilgrimage visiting the Sayyid Zainab Shrine, but through some persistent research efforts, we were able to uncover that a significant number of those individuals are active IRGC ground force commanders. Now, this included a major contingent from the IRGC's West Azerbaijan unit. Again, drawing on experience, this is significant. West Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran regularly deals with PJAK, Turkish militants, separatist groups, and conducts counterinsurgency operations regularly. So this is a unit that's well prepared to train and advise in a counterinsurgent type role. Now, if we look at where these commanders were drawn from, we see that they're all hailing from provincial units that have unique security conditions. So again, up in the northwest, where they have ethnic separatist movements that are ongoing and active, and other provincial areas where there's either large Arab populations or tribal dynamics that impact the internal security, or border issues along the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So these commanders are well positioned and bring unique skills to the Quds Force, who does not usually play the type of role that is required in this type of conflict at this stage as it's evolved. And if we think about when those ground forces commanders got into country, it really maps with the evolution of the conflict. As Joe said, it was really summer 2012 where it started to look more like a counterinsurgency and a civil war, and these particular ground force commanders were rolled up in August 2012. So we see that at that time, we at least began to see evidence of those ground forces in country. So beginning in May 2013 and through to the present day, we saw a spike in deaths of IRGC ground force officers inside of Syria, actually being reported by the Iranian media, which is in and of itself unique. And when I say spike, I mean we hadn't seen any ground force personnel killed in Syria. The only IRGC personnel we had seen was Hassan Shaturi, the senior general, Quds Force, who was killed in February. But beginning in May, I think we saw, I think it's now 8 IRGC ground force officers that have been killed inside of Syria. And this coincides with Lebanese Hezbollah's escalation in Qusair. There's no evidence that these officers were involved in that operation, but it at least indicates that Iran is escalating, if not escalating, expanding the role of its ground forces advisors in that capacity. And again, we see a similar trend. None of these commanders are hailing from major urban centers. They're all being drawn from provincial units, bringing those counterinsurgent sort of unique skills to the table. So as I mentioned earlier, there isn't evidence that there are large numbers of Iranians fighting on the ground. There's no IRGC units in full, brigades, divisions that have been deployed. There's no evidence of that, at least. But we have seen some evidence that there is an informal mobilization of Iranians, sort of one-offs, that's separate from the advisory mission. So for example, there have been reports from credible Syrian opposition activists that Iranians have been embedded with pro-Assad militias in northern Idlib province, for example. And here what you see is an image of a recruiting drive in Tehran. It was an event to sort of celebrate or support the defenders of the Sayyid Zainab Shrine, which are primarily Iran's partners in Proxies. But what you see here is Iranians signing up to deploy to Syria. The sign reads, registration form to deploy to Syria, literally. So we see some evidence that there is some kind of mobilization to just get boots on the ground in Syria. Now, so just to conclude, I just wanted to lay out just the key takeaways from, as I see them at least, from the overview of Iran's security involvement in Syria. So one, Iran is really close to all in with its security organizations. Short of deploying a brigade, deploying a division to fight, there is not a lot that they can do to escalate their involvement, at least from a security perspective. Financially, maybe there's some other things that they can do. Iran's involvement in Syria has evolved from a primarily intelligence support in that role to full-scale MIT teams, training and advising on counterinsurgents and conventional operations. And flowing from that, I think we'll continue to see it evolve and maybe evolve and adapt, I should say. So as the conditions on the ground, the operational picture of the conflict evolves, they're likely to evolve and adapt their strategy as well because they've shown evidence that they can do that. One good example of that, I think, is the escalation of Lebanese Hezbollah and Al-Qusayr and the sort of maybe more slow escalation of Iraqi Shia militant Iranian proxies in Syria as well. But I'll leave that to my colleague Marisa to discuss that more in detail. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming today. Special thanks to ROA for having us here. My name is Marisa Sullivan. I'm a fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. And what I'm going to do is talk to you today about another component of Iran's strategy in Syria, which is the use of partners and proxies. As Will and Joe have mentioned, Iran is really all in Syria. And yet it's still using proxies. Proxies are figuring an even larger role. You're seeing them probably a lot more in the headlines than you have recently. And that's because proxies bring and partners bring an important capabilities that the Assad regime may be lacking in, and that the Iranians are also needing to supplement. So what are those things? Proxies and partners can bring a light infantry capability. The Assad regime has been very strained over the last few years, and it's relying more and more on its artillery and on its air. And so groups like Hezbollah or Iraqi militants can be a light infantry force that can be used on the ground. Likewise, manpower. Numbers count, and as the conflict protracts, the ability to pull on Lebanese fighters, Iraqi fighters to fight in Syria can be a huge boost to the regime, particularly as we've seen in recent weeks. This is going to kind of sound silly, but Arabic language, the ability to communicate directly with Syrian fighters on the ground. This is something that was huge in the training of Iraqi Shia militants with the fight in Iraq. Iran was using Lebanese Hezbollah commanders to train Iraqi forces, one, because they shared a common language, and two, because there was also a reputation and a respect because of the fighting that Hezbollah had been doing in southern Lebanon. So there's the language and the reputation really can't be understated either. Finally, combat experience. These partners and proxies, and when I say partners, I'm talking about Hezbollah. When I'm saying proxies, I'm really talking about the Iraqi Shia militants. They've been on the front lines longer than Iran has and longer than Assad has. They've been fighting in southern Lebanon, and they've been fighting in Iraq, and they've been gaining a lot of experience in the type of guerrilla warfare and urban warfare that you're seeing in Syria today. So they do bring a critical element in that sense. And then finally, the ability to adding more partners and proxies gives Iran and the Assad regime the ability to escalate the situation in Syria without triggering an unacceptable response from the international community. Will talked about how Iran has gone all in, with the exception of sending in a brigade of Quds Force, but they can send in a very large contingent of Lebanese Hezbollah. And as you've seen in recent weeks, it hasn't triggered any crossing of international red lines that you might expect if you see a large contingent of Iranians in Syria. I'm going to first talk about the Iraqi militants who've been operating in Syria. Iran has a history of working with Iraqi Shia militants in its axis of resistance, this Shia crescent that stretches from the Gulf all the way out to the Mediterranean. These groups they see the fight much like Iran does, as a sectarian confrontation, and a fight to to defend both the resistance and to defend Shia populations against an onslaught by radical Sunnis. And the IRGC had been training and funding Iraqi groups for years in Iraq, and most recently during the Iraq War. And so they've been doing that in Iraq, and they've been doing it in Iran, often in partnership with Lebanese Hezbollah. And so over the last few years, they've built up a cadre of very experienced, very disciplined, and well-trained fighters that they have been able to draw on to fight elsewhere. And so I think it's been to Iran's advantage to have essentially another deployable unit that they've called upon to fight in Syria. And we've seen several reports of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, directing more and more Iraqi Shia militants to come to Syria, particularly to defend areas in Damascus around the Sayyida Zainab Shrine, which is a very important shrine in Shia Islam, where the daughter of one of the imams is buried, and to fight elsewhere, but primarily within Damascus. The two main groups I'll talk about today, although there are several others that I'll point out, are Kata'ib Hezbollah and Asa'ib al-Haq. Both are Shia militant groups. Both are very closely allied with the Quds Force. Both have been fighting, U.S. forces have been fighting in Iraq for several years now. And they continue to receive Iranian support and are now deploying in increasingly larger numbers to Syria to fight. There are other groups as well that are mobilizing. We've seen in recent weeks the Badr Corps, which is a longstanding Iraqi militant force that was active during the Iran-Iraq War. We've seen reports of them sending fighters. Muqtada Sadr's Promised Day Brigade, kind of the successor to Jaish al-Mahdi, has deployed fighters, and it's really been there's been a major propaganda push within Iraq to send fighters to Syria and to fight as resistance, and particularly to defend the Sayyida Zainab Shrine. Many of these fighters are fighting under the banner of the Abu Fadl al-Abbas Brigade, AFAB or Liwa, as you might see it in the Arabic acronym. This is a pro-regime conglomerate. It's got Lebanese fighters, it has Iraqi fighters from these various groups, and it's been primarily based in Damascus defending the shrine, although it has been engaged in some operations in areas of Damascus near the shrine. And we've also seen another group that's potentially an offshoot of AFAB, but has very close ties historically to the Quds Force, which is the Kata'ib Sayyid al-Shuhada, which is led by a militant named Abu Musaf al-Shabani, who has long-standing ties going back decades with the Quds Force. So you start to see that the human networks of militants in Iraq appearing in Iraq, appearing now in Syria, and there's kind of a band of usual suspects that now the fight has shifted from Baghdad to Damascus and to Syria. So I think it's important that they are present in Syria. You've seen a lot of propaganda issued by these groups, particularly whenever there are funerals for their martyrs. And they've been very open about their involvement, and both groups, Kata'ib Hezbollah and AH, have admitted their involvement in the last year. So this is not a covert activity by any means. I'd like to now switch over to Hezbollah. Syria matters tremendously to Lebanese Hezbollah. The Assad regime has provided safe haven for training camps historically, and most importantly, it's played a vital role in the supply of weapons, of funding, the transport of fighters from Iran into Lebanon. And the lines of communication have been very important to Hezbollah, and keeping those lines of communication open has been a critical priority. Joe mentioned Damascus and this line that runs, you can see this road here that runs across the border. This is what made Zabadani so important when the rebels took that over. So one of Hezbollah's priorities in Syria is to keep the Assad regime in power insofar as it can keep that steady flow from Iran into Syria. The other reason why Hezbollah has become increasingly engaged in Syria is a little bit north, near Al-Qusayr. This is the Bekaa Valley, and there are a number of Shia Lebanese people who live in towns in Syria around Qusair. And as rebel activity in that area had increased, and you started to see a rebel line of communication supplying weapons from northern Lebanon into Syria, it not only presented a threat to the regime's line of communication from Damascus out to Homs and over to the coast, but it was also threatening Shia villages, Lebanese Shia villages in these areas. And so Hezbollah took it as their mission that they needed to protect the Shia in Syria. And so that's been another impetus for their involvement, and it has become very important in recent weeks with Al-Qusair. I think in terms of other Hezbollah activities, there had been reports of Hezbollah in Syria since the beginning of the conflict in 2011. It's been less overt, or it had been less overt at first. The U.S. Treasury has accused Hezbollah of providing logistical support, training of Syrian forces, training and support to the IRGC in Syria, and this was the dominant mode of operating in the early stages of the conflict. But much more recently, Hezbollah has taken has changed their course in Syria and has escalated dramatically and is involved much more directly in combat. They moved from an advise and assist into a direct combat role, much like the Iranians, but on a much larger scale. I think just to kind of make the point of Hezbollah's evolution in both their activities and their rhetoric, it's useful to see how Hezbollah was justifying or characterizing its involvement in the early stages and see how that has evolved, because there really has been a dramatic shift in terms of how the organization is approaching Syria. In the early stages, as reports were surfacing, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was adamant in denying that that Lebanon was involved in Syria, that Hezbollah was involved in Syria. Even as you started to see in 2012, late 2012, fighters who had been killed in Syria being buried, there were efforts by Hezbollah to kind of keep this a little bit more hush-hush, to not to publicize this. Nasrallah's statement started to evolve as more fighters were killed, as a very senior commander within Hezbollah was killed in the end of September of 2012. The shift was initially to, okay, well, there are elements of Hezbollah fighting in Syria to defend Shia Lebanese along the borders, but the party is not involved as a whole. This was a shift in late 2012 that led to an even more dramatic shift in early 2013 that we'll see in just a moment. Over time, the view of the conflict has changed. It's no longer just about supporting Assad. As sectarian tensions have been bubbling in Lebanon, and as you've seen the border areas between Syria and Lebanon become much more active with rebel forces and Lebanese Hezbollah fighters clashing, it's crystallized in the minds of many Shia in Lebanon the fear that if they don't do something to stop what's happening in Syria, it's gonna spill over and affect them. So if we don't fight in Syria now, we're going to be fighting in Lebanon in the near future, and that's been a dramatic shift. It's in the minds not only of Hezbollah's leadership, but it's also gone a long way into changing the mindset of many supporters of Hezbollah within Lebanon, where they had initially been reticent about reports of Hezbollah's involvement. As sectarian tensions have increased, as you've had more violent incidents, particularly along the border, where you have a number of Shia towns that have been attacked by or rocketed by rebels in Syria, it's crystallized a view that Hezbollah should be involved in Syria. And so, in recent weeks, you have seen Hezbollah much more openly declare their intention to engage in Syria. I think that Hassan Nasrallah's speech at the end of May is very interesting in terms of how Hezbollah leadership is framing the conflict, that Syria is the rear guard, that they need to be fighting in Syria to protect their existence in Lebanon. They've shifted the argument as well. They are still saying that they are a resistance force, and so they're saying that Syria is a confrontation with Israel and a confrontation with the West. But more and more, they're talking about the need to to confront Takfiri Sunni extremists in Syria and prevent them from coming into Lebanon. So I can't underscore just how Hezbollah now has gone all in terms of its support for Assad. It views the Syrian conflict as linked to the situation in Lebanon in a very tight way, and so it's not a separate fight anymore for Hezbollah. So what have they done recently? In early 2012, you started to see more Hezbollah activities. Early 2013 along the border. In April, Hezbollah forces began to clear Shia towns that were in the rural areas surrounding Al-Qusayr. But it was at the end of April and into mid-May that you saw a dramatic commitment of forces and a dramatic move into Al-Qusayr in fighting that began in mid-May. So about 1,200 or so, about 1,000 fighters, Hezbollah fighters, had moved into Syria. The operation in Al-Qusayr is significant because Hezbollah had the lead in the operation. They were the leading force. They were working in partnership with the Syrian military, who was providing artillery and air support, and they were operating on the ground in a very methodical clearing operation through the neighborhoods of Al-Qusayr, and were going block to block, and were clearing what were some fairly formidable defenses that the rebel fighters had built prior to the battle. Hezbollah employed their own engineers to overcome booby traps, tunneling. They saw that the rebels were using a number of tactics that Hezbollah had actually taught Hamas to use in Gaza, and that Hamas, they believe, had transferred that expertise to the rebels for use in Qusayr. And what fighters were talking about is that they were preparing for this type of urban conflict since 2006. The fight in Qusayr was quite different than the rural fighting that you saw the rural fighting that they were used to in southern Lebanon. But they had been, since 2006, training in both guerrilla warfare and urban combat. Some Hezbollah fighters had even mentioned that they had been trained in mock cities in Iran for this type of fighting. And so they really were probably best positioned of Iran and Syria and Hezbollah to take on this fight. And they were successful. They did clear Qusayr and recapture it for the regime. It has severed the line of communication for the rebels, the resupply routes from northern Lebanon into Syria. And with that momentum, they've committed to continuing the push. You've seen Hezbollah take active in a town, Tel Kalak, up here, clearing out that area. You've seen reports of Hezbollah elsewhere in Damascus, as far north as Aleppo, and they seem to be taking lessons from the fight in Qusayr, and that they do have a role to play, and that they are willing to engage more directly in the fight elsewhere. In terms of numbers, the estimates of how many Hezbollah fighters are in Syria varies. Some have said, Secretary Kerry has put it in the thousands. The French foreign minister has put it 3,000, 4,000. The Israelis have said it's 4,000, 5,000. We've seen reports as high as 10,000. There are no good estimates for the numbers, although it's much larger than just the couple hundreds that we had suspected early on. So that's a very notable escalation in the numbers of Hezbollah's involvement, and a noticeable escalation in what Hezbollah is doing. It's not just advising anymore, it's actually clearing and holding terrain. Where do we go from here? This has been a significant turning point where you now have overt and substantial Hezbollah presence in Syria. There's a higher profile of the fight in Syria, and this has actually heightened sectarian tensions in Lebanon. And you've seen that in recent fighting, particularly in Sudan and along the border in the north. And you've seen Hezbollah really committing to defining this fight as a fight for the axis of resistance, a fight to defend the Shia Lebanese and Shia more broadly against an onslaught by the West, an onslaught by Israel, an onslaught by the Takfiris, which I think is an interesting, the Takfiri element I think is an interesting evolution in the way that they're framing it. It's part of a broader confrontation in the region, certainly, and it definitely proves the point that Hezbollah is committed to Assad, is committed to Iran, and it has changed what's going to happen in Syria now. So I think that moving forward, things to watch is how the nature of Hezbollah's involvement continues to evolve. It's important to note that Aleppo is not Qusair. Qusair was very much Hezbollah's backyard, where you did have pockets of Shia Lebanese. That's not the case in the northern parts of Syria. So we'll want to watch how Hezbollah's involvement and how Iran and the Syrians are working with Hezbollah on the ground. And we'll also want to watch what this means for Lebanon, because there have been repercussions of Hezbollah's involvement in Syria in Lebanon. And this also matters for Iran's strategy, because Lebanon is just as important and Hezbollah is just as important to Iran's regional strategy as Syria is. And so I think the two are becoming more intertwined and more complex and challenging for the Iranians as well. So with that, I think we'll just turn it to questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
As the team comes up for questions, I just want to make one larger point. Iran's strategy in Syria is part and parcel of its strategy in the region, and it's global strategy. I think you all know that. But I think it's very important to contextualize all of these developments and the struggle for Syria within Iran's larger objectives, whether they be to defend the population, the Shia population within the Levant, to advance the Islamic Revolution, which are core stated objectives that essentially resonate through all of their policies. But I think that it's also very much part and parcel of some of the larger Iranian strategic objectives that we're watching pursued. The Iranians need to maintain their capability to deter Israel, as they would say, in order to pursue a nuclear program, which they have said is their stated right. So what we're watching here in Syria is something that is ongoing and consistent with these larger strategic objectives, and these larger strategic objectives are obviously governing why it is that Iran finds Syria strategically vital enough to mobilize Iranian proxy groups, Hezbollah in large numbers, to mobilize its own IRGC forces to form MIT teams, to mobilize its population in a volunteer form, and to commit a huge amount of money, arms, weapons, and resources in the midst of a sanctions regime to pursuing this fight. It's important. All right, let's go for questions. Please, sir.
I've got a question mostly for Marissa. When you were saying that, and Nasrallah's statements have been that this is to prevent the West from taking over, it seems to me that there's Al-Qaeda strands and Sunni fight much more than a fight of the West. Can you address that a little bit? Because it seems very strange to me why the West is interjected in Nasrallah's comments when it seems like we have really nothing to do with it.
I think, and I agree that there is kind of an interesting divergence there. The rhetoric about Israel and the West, I think, is to ensure continuity with Hezbollah, with the ethos of the resistance. There had been skepticism within Lebanon about Hezbollah's involvement, and seeing is this really central to the resistance, which has been resisting Israel, particularly in southern Lebanon, by portraying this as a confrontation with Israel and the West in Syria. It is they are trying to keep that continuity of their argument and say that this is still very much a part of the core objectives of the organization. That said, I do think that the sectarian element, the Al-Qaeda element, has galvanized more support in a way that the confrontation with the West and with Israel has not, because it's much more real to them, particularly to Shia living along the border, to Shia Lebanese living within Syria, and within the areas that have seen sectarian conflict in the last few weeks in Lebanon. So I think both are important, some for more rhetorical reasons and some for actual security reasons.
I was also just tack on to that this has been part of the Assad regime's rhetorical construct since really the beginning of the conflict. You see, it's really strange, but you see, Zionists, the West, and Al-Qaeda in the same sentence all the time. Right? No, I know. It seems crazy from our perspective, but and actually, if you even look at Russian media is very clear to talk about how the West is supporting Al-Qaeda, how the U.S. is supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. So it does seem strange from our perspective, but it's definitely a narrative that has traction in the region right now.
Do you think with the election of Hassan Rouhani, any part of the Iranian strategy in Syria will be modified?
Well, that's you.
It's highly unlikely. As I demonstrated, the Iran strategy in Syria is primarily controlled and implemented by the Revolutionary Guards Corps, overseen by the Supreme National Security Council, which is of course overseen by the Supreme Leader. Rouhani has a lot of things on his plate, and least of all, I think, for him, at least domestically, is the conflict in Syria. So I don't think that his election will have any impact. It might change the discourse domestically in Iran, but as has been laid out, Syria is so strategically important to Iran that they are not going to be willing to give up the fight because a sort of moderate president has come to power who hasn't really come out against Iran's strategy in Syria either.
And just to reinforce that, I think we've seen a lot of rhetoric within a number of elements of the Iranian state reinforcing that its foreign policy is not actually going to change.
So very soon after the presidential election, I think it was 1 or 2 days after, Iran announced they were going to be sending, I think it was 4,000 troops, combat troops, as I understood it, to fight in Syria. One, what is the accuracy of that? Is that going to happen? And two, if there are not just a few advisors, but thousands of Iranians fighting and dying in Syria, will Iranians see that as close to their survival as clearly Shia and Lebanon have viewed it?
Well, with respect to the accuracy of the report, I can only say that there's really no available evidence that there's that number of Iranians fighting on the ground. I mean, we can comfortably say that there are ground force advisors and Quds Force personnel in Syria, and I of course, could be surprised by this conflict, as I have been throughout the course of it. I don't expect them to deploy those numbers, so I don't think it will be an issue domestically for them where it becomes about survival of their regime per se, in the context of large numbers of Iranians fighting and dying there. It's important to the survival of the regime because of how important Syria is to Iran strategically, but in terms of actual security for their population, I don't see that in the near future, at least.
Actually, well, can you just follow up with we had a discussion actually among the analysts on precisely that news report, because it was something, it really was something that we looked at closely, because the first time that we get numbers in that variety, we really want to understand and verify the accuracy of that reporting. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the fact that we found that the source of information itself was not credible.
Yeah, I guess, there isn't too much more to say, but the bottom line was that based on the perspective of the author and some of the other elements of the report, there wasn't a lot of credibility to be lent to that specifically.
Yeah. Thanks for a great presentation. You guys have made it very clear, both sort of at the strategic level and the tactical level, what the game is all about for Iran, which is protecting their development of a nuclear capability and regional hegemony. So what do we do? You step back and you look at the presentation and as the Russians would say, the correlation of forces, and U.S. interests are not being well served at all by developments there if we assume, as I do, that we have to prevent the Iranians from obtaining a nuclear capability. What do we do?
Thanks very much for the question. I'm going to start taking this for the team, and I actually will then turn over to the team. look, I think we have two different questions here. We have three different questions here that are actually strategic threats that we need to put on the table. One is the threat of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, which is a discussion and argument and briefing worthy of attention. I actually think we've done a little bit of that here in this very forum, and it sounds to me as though it's time for Masih Zarif, the expert on the Iranian nuclear program among the team, to come back and brief y'all on what's going on. The second question is, what do we do about Syria? And the third question, I think, that has really come to the fore over the past 4 weeks for us is, what do we do about the fact that there is actually a regional sectarian conflict underway within the Middle East, which does not serve our national interests at all. So what I'm going to do for the purposes of this discussion, to let these tremendous folks talk, is actually ask Joe to comment a little bit on Syria, what should we do and what can be done, and then I can link it back to that strategic picture.
I think what I'll actually use this opportunity to quickly talk about something very specific that I think we could do, because the Syrian conflict is so it's so complex, and there's so many costs to any beneficial action that we could conduct. It's one of those things where there's a lot of respects, no good options it may seem, or at least there's strong counter arguments for anything. So what I will do is talk about one thing I think we need to take very seriously, which is Iranian physical resupply of assets and movement of personnel into Syria. That seems to me to be something that is concrete, that could potentially be addressed. It used to be that Iran would fly its support over Turkish airspace into Syria. Sorry, this is Iraq. Iran's over there somewhere. Over Turkish airspace into Syria. That changed recently for two reasons. One, we gave up control over Iraqi airspace at the end of a couple of years ago. And two, the Turks started forcing down Syrian planes. They did that the first time in the fall of 2011, where they forced down an Iranian jet with a bunch of military equipment in it. So that leaves Iran to now be providing Syria with primarily an air bridge. Most of the support that Iran is getting into Syria, both equipment and personnel, is through flying them directly into airports, air bases inside Syria. First of all, I would just point out that that's one of the reasons why their investment is so heavy. We've learned how frightfully expensive an air bridge is in our operations in Afghanistan. Ilyushin 76s take a lot of jet fuel too, and a lot of spare parts. And it's definitely something that must be costing Iran dearly to maintain that air bridge. I just point out that that Syria has a lot of, I'm not going to go all the way back, but there's a lot of air bases in Syria, and even as the rebels overrun some of them, there's many more that are going to remain wide open, particularly in sort of this segment of the country from Palmyra, sort of this whole desert sort of area north and east of Damascus. There's a ton of air bases out there that would be very easy for the regime to defend because they're in the middle of the desert, and that type of fields of fire definitely support the regime's strengths. So that's air. Ground. They can't use this ground resupply route via Iraq anymore because the rebels control it now. Am I pointing the right place? Yes. This is Abu Kamal and Al-Qaim on the Iraq side. Rebels seized control of Abu Kamal in September and then walked it all the way back to Deir ez-Zor. The regime, Iran via Iraq, cannot send ground convoys this route any longer. This route, at the latest, fell to the rebels. When was that? In the beginning of this year, basically. But potentially earlier than that, like July time frame, when the regime really pulled out of this part of the country and left it to the Syrian Kurds, basically, in that area. So this route is untenable. The only ground route left is this one down here. It's Al-Walid and At-Tanf on the other side of this border here. It's the middle of the desert, big highway, but there's already been some ambushes out here of Iraqi insurgents attacking convoys in this case, it was Syrian soldiers being repatriated into Iraq. So that's key. Last is sea locks, right? So they can try to get resupply into Tartus or Latakia or Banias ports. We've only seen them come through the Suez Canal twice. In both cases, we have no evidence to suggest that they were able to actually supply equipment. It was more of a, fly the flag type of operation. It's very obvious when you go through the Suez Canal, but that doesn't mean that they can't, through intermediaries or through other means, get weapons resupply to these ports from, gray market arms dealers in Odessa, for example. So that's sort of the last route. So I guess I'd point out that if they could shut this down or make it really, really difficult, if you can mitigate the regime's ability to resupply by air, and if you can mitigate their ability to use third parties to resupply with weapons via sea, then you can seriously undermine Iran's ability to support the regime.
Well,
that would be a possible way of going about that, but I think there's actually less costly ways to achieve the same objective.
Why don't you talk about that?
No-fly zone?
No, the other ways.
Oh, yeah. Well, fair enough. I think that, there's covert options I think you could choose to try to destroy aircraft on the runway. I think you could take much more offensive operations to destroy aircraft capabilities, such as crater runways, go after fuel capabilities, and basically make it impossible for anyone to land in Syrian air bases. It seems like a small distinction between no-fly zone and that, but the reality is the no-fly zone is you're opening up a open-ended commitment to patrol Syrian airspace in a war that could go on for a decade. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that's problematic. Whereas a discrete period of strikes designed to cripple Syrian air capacity might be a more circumscribed approach to achieving that. And as far as this is concerned, I don't know. Where Jordan's sitting right now on this. I'm obviously paying attention to it, and it's a question of how this thing escalates. But this would, I don't think, be very difficult under the right set of circumstances politically. From a military perspective, it wouldn't be too hard for Jordan to shut that down. Yeah.
All right, and all of those courses of action rely on fairly sophisticated capabilities that I think we should not expect the rebels to have. If they have them, then that could be a problem. All right.
Related question to that, which is if we did a limited discrete airstrike, something like that, and attempted to close some of the ground lines of communication, what's the reaction of the Iranians? You've already said they're all in. What more would or could they do in reaction to that?
Yeah.
So I think this is I'll actually expand that to briefly to encapsulate Russia on this too, because I think that's one of the common conversations about sort of any U.S. Incremental involvement in the conflict is, U.S. does more, the reaction is going to be escalation, and there's a strong argument for that. It's natural, but based off of all of our analysis, I don't know how much more Iran can really afford to pour into this conflict, and so I don't know whether escalation would be their course of action. In fact, I assess that it would not be. That they could, I think they would try to escalate further, but I don't know what capacity they'd really have to add that much more to the fight. As far as Russia is concerned, depending on how overt things are, I think that Russia might take an opposite response to it. Covert approach, Russia can continue to ratchet up, and I think very likely will. I think a more overt approach, you might see a different reaction from the Russians. I'm not a criminologist, so I'll just leave that as as a question. And then, the last thing is, the last thing I'd point out is last fall, a number of us had a long war game conversation about what options might exist to degrade the regime's air capacity. And we looked at potential, costs, potential outcomes of each of these courses of action. And one of the things we were most concerned about in all cases was escalation. In all cases, we were concerned in particular that the Assad regime would escalate. If they lost their ability to use their air force, how would they escalate? And the number one concern of all of these, this was October of last year, was they might start using ballistic missiles to go after the population. By December, there we were. So I think that there is a little bit of a concern, in my view, that to sort of assume that escalation will only happen in the case of action. In some cases, and I think largely speaking, escalation is happening independent of U.S. action here.
So, you talked a lot about the importance of degrading Iran's capabilities in terms of resupplying the regime and the regime's capabilities in general. When you talk about that, are you talking about strategically, are you talking about it in terms of unilateral U.S. action, or are you talking about it in terms of supplying rebel forces? And if you are talking about it in terms of supplying rebel forces, how do we go about it, and is it even possible to vet the rebel forces that are on the ground, considering the partial radicalization of a lot of those groups? I mean...
So, I mean, I think...
And you might as well just
but yeah,
stand
so, I mean, I
here.
think that... Look, and this is sort of the caveat I began with, is that there's obvious costs to any course of action. But I think that unless we're willing to concede that it's okay for Assad to win, with Iranian support, which I think is actually, there's a cold argument to be made for that. I think the time for that argument was back in August of 2011, before we said that Assad should step down. But there's a strong, coldly realist argument for let Assad win. It's too complicated for us to try to deal with the different levels of radicalization within the opposition. But given where we are now, this conflict is going to go on for a long time. And I think the longer this conflict goes on, the more radical everybody becomes, not just the opposition, but the regime. I mean, particularly talking about sort of the most ultranationalist brands of the militias that exist within the Syrian regime. And so I think it's in interest. It's in the national interest, and in particular when you start talking about like where Jordan sits right now in Lebanon in terms of spillover and stability there, for this conflict to draw to a close sooner rather than later. And unless we're willing to try to set the conditions for Assad to have a victory, then I think we need to start considering what options exist, even given the fact that there are serious risks that should be considered in the context of them.
First, three great presentations. I think you added a lot of nuance and granularity to some aspects of the conflict that I think don't get a lot of attention. I wonder if I could draw you out, any or all of you, on this issue of what is being resupplied, what is actually going from Iran, both to Hezbollah and to Syria, how it's going. I mean, the traditional route pre-conflict was that stuff was landing in Damascus airport and then going into Lebanon. So now is that being reversed? And obviously there's certain red lines that the Israelis have articulated about high-end things like CW that they're most concerned about, but the implication seems to be if it goes across into the Bekaa. So who is retaining control of especially some of this high-end stuff, man-pads or anti-tank stuff that may be being resupplied by the Iranians, if it's happening on Syrian territory? In other words, is Hezbollah getting new capabilities while they're in Syria without it being across? And Joe, if I could just, as a broader issue, when you say that you think the Iranians have gone as far as they're going to go on, not supplying more troops, if they're all in, especially if they gain a nuclear capability or the perception of one, is there a risk that down the road, if this drags on, we could see sort of a Vietnam syndrome, U.S. 1964, where, things are not going their way and they just need to put more and more in, and the Basij go in and the Pasdaran go in, and pretty soon you've got, 20,000 guys on the ground.
Joe, Will, who wants to start? Marisa wants to start.
On that last point, what I think
Marisa.
is interesting is their escalation has worked by adding expertise, by adding Hezbollah, by adding other types of technical capabilities. The momentum certainly has shifted in the direction of the Assad regime. So I think that that's just something to bear in mind, that where we are right now is very much working in Iran's favor. And in terms of, as we talk about escalation, it seems like Assad and his allies have escalated significantly over the last 2 years, and we're still down at this level. So they already have there's not a parity in escalation that exists, and they don't need to go too much farther to maintain the gains they've already created.
Will, you want to? No, I think you're probably better to discuss
Look, no, I think that's the question. How much further could they go? But then I think the other question that's really, 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 really fundamental here is just getting at this assumption that that the action for escalation is an outside action, when in fact what we see is the regime and its allies escalating at what is a really pretty slow rate. And this is actually something I want to talk about and go back to. Because if we actually look at the reliance and dependence of the regime on Iranian resupply and on air resupply back in the November 2012 timeframe, December 2012, January 2013, the vulnerability that the regime faced was extraordinary because it was actually having to do aerial resupply to tactical as well as strategic locations. It was not able to move along the GLOCs, although its armed forces still had the capabilities that Joe has so brilliantly discussed in his discussion of the Assad regime's order of battle. They did not have the manpower to fill out the units in a way to generate sufficient combat power to do multiple simultaneous operations in different parts of the country. So over the past 6 months, the vulnerability of the regime to any campaign to disrupt air resupply has changed. And it's not that they aren't vulnerable, it's still a critical vulnerability, but it has raised in many respects, I think, a couple of points for me. One, that time was on the regime's side, but it took a long time for the regime to escalate in this way. So as we're talking about reaction and counter-reaction, we may just ask, even if the Iranian regime is all in, what is the next escalation step it can take in the time that we're talking about? And I think the second thing that we can learn is that the escalation steps continue whether or not there's actions from US, West, or Zionists. All right. Do you have anything to fill out?
Yeah, I think the only part of your question that I would address is this basically going to become some sort of quagmire for Iran because they just continue to dump resources. And I think Marisa really got at that, and that's the escalation that they have put in has been successful for them. So they've adapted their strategy along the way in a way that it's been successful for them. So we don't really know at this stage what happens if it no longer is successful. They continue to pour resources in, and then they start to get rolled back in some of the areas that they've been successful in. But at this point, they haven't had to deal with a quagmire, so we can't really assess how they're going to react if the conditions change in that way.
Yeah, I think they're through their quagmire. So, folks, I really, really appreciate your attendance today, your participation online. I wish we had time for dozens more questions and dozens more answers from this fine group. But I hope that you will, of course, check out the websites of the respective organizations hosting, whether it be the Reserve Officers Association, the Institute for the Study of War, or the Critical Threats Project. And I hope that you will join me in a round of applause for Joe Holliday, Marisa Sullivan, Wolf Fulton, and the wonderful briefings that they gave today. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us.